thank you again for joining today's session. And I'm Jeff Van Heumen, Director of Business Development at the Ontario Centre of Innovation. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge the land on which we gather today. OCI's work takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across the province. We acknowledge that there are 46 treaties and other agreements that cover the territory now called Ontario. We are thankful to be able to work and live in these territories. Just a reminder that during the session, we will encourage you to put in your questions in the Q&A portion of the Zoom link, and for any questions that you may have during the presentation, and I'm hopeful that you will have many. And I'll try my best to get the presenters to answer all of those, but if not, we will address those following the session. As many of you know, OCI, Ontario Centre of Innovation, builds capacity in emerging and advanced technologies. We strengthen and leverage Ontario's tech sector, and most importantly, and the reason we are here today, we accelerate the commercialization of Made in Ontario IP. As many of you know, we know IP can dramatically alter the trajectory of a company. Those companies that include IP strategy as part of a business plan are better positioned to capture the associated growth benefits associated with that recognition. And it is for that reason that OCI and the Innovation Asset Collective, IAC, are very pleased to have you join this virtual education session today. We also know that SMEs like you are key drivers of IP-related prosperity and their outcomes. We are also excited to be talking about precision ag, particularly today, with a special fireside chat with Paul Raymer, the co-founder and president of SoilOptix. So I hope you'll find today's Ag Tech Precision Ag session and particularly helpful, and I encourage you to take advantage of the expertise brought to us by IAC's VP of IP Strategy, Erin Pisko, and VP Partnerships and Member Engagement, DeGraw, as well as Paul Raymer, co-founder and president of SoilOptix. So now, with no further to discuss, we're going to kick things off here with a few introductions. I'll now turn the session over to Lori and Erin, who are presenting on building IP capacity in Canadian SMEs. Lori is VP of Partnerships and Member Engagement at IAC, supporting the growing ecosystem of IAC member companies and working on strategic collaborations with the innovation sector. Lori is an experienced executive and board director dedicated to supporting Canadian success stories with several appointments, including on the board of directors for the Canadian Olympic Committee and TO Live. Erin provides strategic leadership centered on innovation strategy to member companies with objective of building intellectual property roadmaps aligned with business objectives and IP literate workforces. Erin is a registered patent agent and with decades of experience working both in-house, building out ecosystems for innovation, and at top-tier Canadian law firms, assisting companies from diverse industries in transforming their innovation strategy. Throughout Erin's career, her passion has been to help companies of all sizes find their aha moment of their initial discovery and building on that moment to drive value in everyday aspects of the business. Erin holds a master's and bachelor's degree in civil and environmental engineering. Boy, that's a lot. So without further ado, what I would like to do is hand the microphone over to Lori and then Erin to give us the IAC presentations.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Really appreciate this and really appreciate everyone who's attended today. Thank you so much for being part of our session. And believe me, after you hear Erin and I speak, you'll want to stay tuned for Paul's presentation from SoilOptix. I got a bit of a preview, and you'll definitely want to stay in the mix for that. So thank you for being here today. I'm going to present first a little bit of context, and then Erin will also present some of the specifics around thinking around IP strategy, and also, of course, about working in the precision ag space specifically. Thanks. I'll take the next slide. Thank you. So one of the things we want to highlight is that IP is everywhere. There's a bit of a misconception, we know from some of our work with member companies and others in the innovation space, that there's this thinking that IP is some very niche technical exercise that you kind of just hope you're going to throw to your legal department and somebody's going to figure out what to do with that part of your business. But that can be really a detriment, because IP is something that can become really a differentiator. It's something that's baked into your business strategy, your value proposition, and it's something incredibly important for everyone to be thinking about as a culture, as a corporate culture. So we have a great quote here from the board chair of IAC. Many of you may be familiar with Jim Balsillie, and he certainly has had experiences within the space and understands if you don't own the space that you're working in, you're never going to be able to really lock it down for future prosperity. Next slide, please. So what's changed in this world? This wasn't necessarily always the focus of Canadian SMEs, but you can see here from this S&P chart how things have changed since 1975, when tangible assets were the bulk of a company's value, and that's a time when you can think about, a factory out of Michigan that sourced out resources and controlled its supply chain from start to finish. So there were very tangible values in companies at that time. But when you look at 2019, and you could see a significant shift in a fairly short period of time around intangibles becoming the bulk of a company's value. So from that small ratio of 17% in 1975 to 91% today. So this is a significant story to note and to think about as you're building out your own business. Next slide, please. How is the country doing? Unfortunately, we've got a lot of work to do. You can see from this chart that Canada is still really a minor player in this space in terms of top of 1,000 global innovators. I think perhaps you can see on your screen the tiny little dot that is Canada in the bottom left quadrant of this slide. So it's something that we know we need to work on, and we need to be able to help our companies create more value through IP and intangibles. Next slide, please. So the federal government recognized this. Some of the experts in the IP space recognized this, and as a result, created a national IP strategy in 2019. And IAC was developed as a result of that and became a key pillar of moving that strategy forward. It was part of a process where IAC was selected to develop a pilot project to focus on clean tech companies, specifically data-driven clean tech companies. And we're a member-based organization that's been operating for about 2 years with a program to support SMEs in that space. Next slide, please. So what this means is we are helping to create more bench strength around all the things I positioned off the top. So understanding what role IP can play in your business, how creating these really incredible IP and data positions can mean significant growth, taking control, which also means mitigating risk, because that's another big part of the story with IP. Having the right information to make really good decisions. We all know that no one has endless resources to throw at anything when growing a business. So you want to have as much information as you can to make the right calls around where to invest. And then, of course, through our own program, the very unique element is that we do so through a very collective approach, and I'll describe more about what that looks like in upcoming slides. So the program we developed has 4 key pillars. I'm going to dig into each one of them a little bit, but the overview is that they are IP strategy and education, which is the foundation and underpinning of all of the program. We have an IP funding mechanism through grants, We are building out an IP portfolio, which is probably a new concept to some, although I know we have some member companies on this call, so they know what that's all about. And then, of course, market intelligence to help with that good information to make good decisions. So I'll get into each one of these now. The IP and education strategy is really to think about how that foundational information can help you not only map out what your IP strategy is, your business strategy and value proposition. Erin's going to speak to this in amazing detail in a moment, but really it's about making sure that you know how to speak about this world. You want to be able to not necessarily technically file things, but you want to know how to be able to speak about it, to speak with your patent lawyers and others who help you in this space. So we keep it very practical for business leaders to access and also move forward within their own knowledge base. Next slide, please. IP funding comes in a couple different forms at IAC specifically. We do have a membership fee to join. It's $15,000 a year, but can be prorated depending on where you join. So what we've determined to do with that fee is not to maintain that. It's not a revenue stream for us. In fact, what we want to do is make sure that you're using all that education that you're gaining through the education program and putting it into application. So we hold that membership fee on behalf of each member company. And as you spend money on IP, you are reimbursed for it. You submit an invoice that you paid and we will reimburse you right up to that maximum $50,000. We also do have an incremental grant program, which is a competitive program. So we're challenging our member companies to come up with the very best ideas they can that will move their business forward, be able to explain the strategy and how they've thought this through. And then we also provide those grants to help them actually develop new IP and some other ideas around their IP strategy. Next slide, please. The IP portfolio I mentioned is a little bit of a novel concept, not internationally, but in Canada, it's the first one that's ever been developed. And this is our team developing and acquiring IP assets from the global marketplace that we know are significant in the space that our member companies work in, so within the clean tech sector. We are acquiring these IP assets and holding them as a defensive shield on behalf of our member companies. So just to be clear around this, because some don't understand it, this doesn't mean anyone who's a member of IAC is feeding IP into our portfolio. We're acquiring this out in the marketplace. And really the idea about this is not for commercialization, it really is to protect the interests of our member companies as they're growing. It takes a long time to grow a portfolio. We're just hoping that in the interim, while our member companies are building out a really well thought through portfolio, we are collecting this defensive shield to hold on their behalf. And next slide, please. Finally, market intelligence. We have a team dedicated to going into clean tech on a regular basis, especially into subsectors of clean tech, because it is a broad sector space, and creating these very detailed reports on what's been going on in the space. This is intended to help our member companies sort of see where there's been some perhaps activity around legal issues that they might want to steer clear of. It helps them perhaps see white space where there's opportunity, but it really is meant to do a deep dive to help them have the information they need to make very good decisions and again, use their resources well. Next slide, please. So here's a summary of what we've been working on. So the education coming in the form of webinars and panel discussions. We really designed this as an asynchronous product so that busy business leaders can come into it as they have the capacity and continue to move along at their own pace. We have networking events for members only, the IP grant program. You can see some of the available funds on that front, and the market intelligence reports, which for those of you who have not generated this type of thing can be at a cost of $75,000 to $100,000 if it were with a third-party provider. So we're really pleased to be able to offer that benefit to our members as well. And then finally, access to that IP patent portfolio to protect interests of member companies as they're growing. Next slide. So finally, all of this builds out into that idea of IP strategy. And when we're talking about companies being able to control their destiny, stake out their territory, add value, and have a cultural shift within their organization so that they're structured around the best way to position their IP. Erin's an expert in this space, so I'm going to throw it to her to walk you through what that looks like.
Great, thanks, Lori. So when we're talking about IP strategy, Lori's really given a good intro. It's about having a plan. You want to really think about how you're going to protect your ownership of the assets that really drive value and revenue for your business. Next slide. So a question we get most often is, wow, I'm really small. Like, when should I possibly start thinking about strategy? I need to get my business up and running. And I would challenge that with, you're never too small to have a strategy, but don't be intimidated, because having an IP strategy doesn't mean you have like a 50-page plan with execution. It can be as simple as just, you know, a couple of thoughts jotted down on paper, and that you're executing on a plan. You've started your business for a reason. You've started your company for a reason. And it's about building assets to help you support that value proposition that your company's there to fulfill. When companies fail to take a consideration of having a strategy up front, particularly around their IP, and because of the long lead times it takes to develop these assets, you can really expose yourself to risk right at the start. We've heard from many different people that you know, I don't hold any IP assets. I'm not really there yet, so I don't have any risk. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. You can encounter risk from the day you start your company, and your assets can really be there as part of your strategy and your plan to also work on having a shield around that piece. And the other piece of the strategy that's really important to consider when you get going is your culture. If you think about things, it's really easy to pivot when you're small and you're nimble and really in a dynamic place. It's much harder once your company's built up and established to really change that culture. So getting started talking about IP, making it part of conversations across the business, moving it out of boardroom discussions and into the mainstream right from the beginning when you're getting going is a great way to get started. Next slide. So when you start looking at developing assets absent a strategy, what often ends up happening is they're hindsight focused. You're focused on protecting what you've already done, not where you're going. And it can really hinder your ability to grow and scale as you're moving ahead. Whereas a forward-looking position can really set you up for success by putting you in a great position to attract financing, attract investors. It allows you to make better decision-making, really better use the funds you have available for these assets to develop real strategic key deliverables that can really help you grow your business. And, you know, wrapping an IP assets around your key revenue stream, when you're forward looking, you can really have a chance to build as opposed to when you're retroactive. Next slide. But getting started is the hard part. So we like to try to break things down at IAC into some basic components. And I just use some basic circles here, just sort of visualize these concepts. And I think if you think about when you start a business and companies are starting down a path, again, you started for a reason. What's your edge? What's your angle? How do you differentiate yourself? What service are you offering that you think is different than everybody else? And then how is it filling a gap in the market? What's the pain point that your consumers are feeling, your potential customers? Maybe it's individual customers, maybe it's companies, but how are you addressing a gap in their business or driving efficiencies for them that they haven't been able to do for themselves? And understanding what else is happening out there in the landscape. You're not an island, you're maneuvering in a large marketplace. And so it's really important to understand what's the white space, what's available to you from an ownership position, and potentially you can't lock down an entire space. You know, IP assets are competitive. The more as companies develop and understand where they're going, more and more people are starting to develop strategies. But if you really understand that white space and you look to protect that value revenue stream, you can start developing those assets that are available to you. And potentially you can even use those as leverage against getting access to other assets as you grow. Next slide. But how much does it cost? This comes up all the time. I can't afford it. I'm a small company. I have lots of things I need to develop. Strategy is the key to solving that problem. Because when you think ahead and you start planning for understanding where your revenue is coming from and where those niche differentiators, the things that set you apart and how those line up with your value and your revenue stream, you can really start getting strategic and you can work on developing IP assets just around those revenue streams and really stay focused. There's no requirement to start building this massive portfolio when you get going. It's about developing these key assets, prioritizing your spend around what's going to enable you to grow and scale, and understanding what's already out there in the landscape. And Lori mentioned our intelligence reports being available to members. They can really help you being able to navigate that space and understand what roadblocks other people have put up. And when you plan in advance, you can maneuver around them and position yourself around them, because it's about not just planning for tomorrow, but down the road. IP assets, patents might be the most well-known asset, but they're not the longest term asset. They have a 20-year life. Branding, trademarks, trade secrets, copyrights, they can really last the lifetime of a business. And so if you plan accordingly, you can really create this value proposition for your company. Next slide. So I'm just going to quickly preview the different types of IP. We're not going to go into them. So once you come up with a strategy, it's about figuring out what type of assets fit your business. Not everybody will have all the different types of IP rights that really fit with their business. So we have patents. They're kind of the most common. They are wrapped around inventions, innovations. Where do you have this technical challenge that you've solved? The flip side of that is protecting your confidential information and in particular your trade secrets. So where you really decide you want to lock something down because it really sets you apart, it's not easy to reverse engineer. You want to think about those types of assets. You can wrap some copyright around, it's most commonly known in the music field around literary works, but copyright exists in all forms of business. Think of all your manuals, your customer lists, your databases. There's copyright attached to all those. And, understanding those assets, they don't actually require registration. There's some common law rights that can exist in those if you sort of track them properly. Industrial design is about the look and the feel. Coca-Cola, that bottle, that shape, it's recognizable around the world. But there's lots of companies that are using industrial designs. One of the big Canadian success stories, Lululemon, they have hundreds and hundreds of industrial design patents that protect the look and the feel of their products that are commonplace in the market. And lastly, we have trademarks. It's your brand, that company name. The day you come up with a name for your company, you've already created an IP asset in your brand and who your company is. Next slide. So I just did a quick recap on patents because they are sort of almost the first intersection point, particularly in a data-driven clean tech space. There's usually some sort of technical innovation. And I really think about patents as a business tool. Yes, they're a legal asset you develop, but you develop them to be a business tool. They're a business asset for your company to allow you to exclude others from working in that space. Because you might have heard patents are a negative right. It's a common misconception that a patent actually gives you the right to practice your own invention. It's actually the exact opposite. It gives you the right to exclude, but in order to be able to move forward and practice your own innovations, that's where navigating that landscape is really important and making sure you understand you're not stepping on anybody else's toes and anybody else's IP assets. They're jurisdictional. You protect where you file. There's no such thing as an international patent. There are mechanisms where you can delay needing to file, but if you really need to lock down a market, say in Mexico, you need to file your application in Mexico to really lock that down. And really all patent documents, as I said, they're business tools. And once you learn how to read them, you can get really fast at it. They're all structured the same way. Generally speaking, it doesn't matter where you file them. There are two primary components of all patent documents, and that's what we call the specification. It's the description. It's what tells you where the innovation is, what the space is, where it's filed, and then what we call the claims. And that's the little white picket fence that you build around your house that you're excluding others from entering. Next slide. So we're soon to release our landscape report on precision agriculture. And since we're talking about strategy, I wanted to give you a couple of strategic insights that we're seeing when we're digging through the data that IAC is compiling for you. And what's really interesting, I think, in this space is the diversity that you see in the types of filers who sort of exist in that top 10. If you look at who the top 10 filers are in the precision ag space, there's some diversity there, and there's a real evolution of companies where we're seeing who maybe existed in the traditional machinery space. You know, John Deere's been around since I was a kid, and was really commonly known for agriculture and equipment, off-highway equipment, heavy-duty engines. But they're really expanding into monitoring, precision mapping, remote sensing. And so there's this real trend that we're seeing, particularly amongst these traditional machinery players, to be looking to expand their portfolio into these other areas. A lot of that's happening by way of acquisition and partnership. So huge opportunity for SMEs in the precision ag space to work with these big players. John Deere in particular runs an interesting partnership program. They've got a few in progress with some different UAVs. We also have a couple big pharma players, not pharma, but chemical manufacturer players in this space that were traditionally on the chemical and pharmaceutical development side. And through acquisitions, they've really expanded into the agriculture space. Bayer acquired Monsanto back in 2014 to 2016 and really got their foothold in the agriculture space, whereas BASF has taken an investment route, and they're really investing in some SME companies who are in this agricultural space. So we're really seeing some interesting trends happening that really create opportunities for SMEs. Next slide. The next thing I wanted to highlight is what's happening on the global stage. So if you think about sort of that top 10, I've highlighted sort of 6 of the bigger heavy machinery players here. What's happening on the global stage? What are we seeing? What we're seeing, as I said, as these companies are expanding, we're seeing a lot of acquisitions and partnerships. And there's also a really low litigation rate that I think is evident, that because that's how they're looking to expand into the space. It's not through necessarily litigation, but it's through these opportunity-driven collaborations. There's a huge footprint happening in the precision ag space in China, but it's generally concentrated just within China. Tons of investment in the R&D space within universities, a massive filing footprint in China, but we're not seeing that expansion outside of that huge footprint outside of China happening. So that's really interesting. Lots of research happening there, but it's yet to bubble past their own borders. Big investment in the US markets in terms of the evolution from what they're predicting from 2021 to 2030. There's huge growth planned and anticipated in this space in the US. And what's happening in Canada, we see, like, in terms of preferred jurisdiction, despite having, you know, we've been a resource-based economy for a long time. We have a large agriculture base. We're not seeing it to have been the real preferred jurisdiction for patent filing. There's a much greater concentration in filings happening in Japan and China, and Canada's really down the list. So lots more insights available that are going to be available in our landscape report. And for members, you're able to dig into the data and work with some of our experts as well. Next slide. So just lastly, a few comments on what's happening in Canada. So through the last 4 or 5 years where COVID hit, we really saw this lost earnings that happened within the Canadian farming industry. And I really think it's led to some of this digitization, the real push in innovation using analytics, lots of new players coming in the market. We're seeing farm sizes doubling. A lot of that's thought to be because of technological advancements, that you can really manage more land because of some of the analytics that are coming out there. We're seeing changes in consumer behavior that's much more focused on where does my food come from? How is it processed? What does that look like? And understanding how those changes in consumer behavior are changing the industry is really important. Since 2018, we've seen 166 new startups in Canada in the precision ag space. And lastly, the government is really running some big incentive programs in this sector. There's a huge Canadian agricultural partnership that is a large multi-billion-dollar investment. Canada's really looking to prompt agricultural innovations. And SDTC, one of our key partners, has also created funding for specific clean tech companies in this space. And in 2021, they awarded $55 million for funding for companies in this space. So it's really, really exciting things happening, I think, and lots to come. With that, I'm I don't know, Jeff, I can't recall if we're going to take actual questions, but I think we can turn it over to our precision ag specialist and see and see what he's got to say.
Terrific. Thank you, Erin and Laurie, for that excellent insight in terms of IP strategy. We're going to hold questions till the end because I know that there's going to be more than enough at that point, so that we have the time that we need with Paul to kind of go into the SoilOptix IP journey. Just a reminder to everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A for when we finish the discussion with Paul, and we'll be happy to address those at that time. So what I'm thrilled to be able to do is to introduce Paul Raymer, the co-founder and president of SoilOptix, to our fireside chat. It'll be a little bit of a nuanced fireside chat, but SoilOptix is precision ag. And in this short discussion that we're going to have this afternoon, he's going to go over all things related to SoilOptix. In that, I wanted to introduce Paul. Paul is a farm boy. He grew up on a dairy farm in Oxford County and received his certification in mechanical engineering technology from Fanshawe College, specializing in industrial and specializing in mobile equipment design. Paul has a wide range of agricultural industry experience along with military experience, and has formerly worked with a number of engineering teams at John Deere. As interesting that Erin raised that just recently, and then General Dynamics as well. One of Paul's successes was being instrumental in pioneering a real-time crop sensing variable rate nitrogen application system for late season corn. His passion for technology and agriculture led him to develop and educate farmers and agronomists across North America and internationally on the opportunity for utilizing high definition soil maps. I could go on about Paul and his groundbreaking initiatives. However, I would rather that he spoke to it. So with that, I'm going to kick us off with a few questions for Paul, but the first one I want to do for your benefit is, Paul, do you want to introduce you and SoilOptix to our audience?
Certainly, Jeff. Thank you very much. Thank you for that intro. And it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invite to participate in let's say this very worthwhile discussion. And it's hard footsteps to follow in, let's say, the ladies and let's say their presentation and outlining, let's say, the fabulous resource that IAC has to offer. But I'll do a screen share here of my presentation. I assume that it is up. If not, please let me know.
Yep.
Okay,
we can see it, Paul.
Okay, so yes, I'm co-founder and president of this company called SoilOptix. Now, this is pertaining around soil. Soil may come to you as maybe thinking of, let's say, a really boring topic. There's not a whole lot of excitement with soil, but it's not with what soil is itself. It's about with what's in the soil is what matters. And that's what we're here measuring, because that's what matters to farmers. So to give a little bit of, to dive in a little bit with what we do, make sure here we go. So soil is extremely complex and variable, okay? And in a farmer's mind, their field is, let's say, their business unit. It is their factory, in other words, okay? So, but what do farmers want to know out of their field is they want to know where they can optimize inputs, being fertilizer, seed, and water. Those are really kind of the big inputs for what they can control. Now, when I say water, that is, let's say, around, let's say, irrigation, if let's say they're irrigating, but largely it's fertilizer and seed, okay? But out of, let's say, that field, in the back of their minds, they're thinking, where is, let's say, those pockets of opportunity? Where in that field can they save on possible inputs? And where can they add? And if so, where can they add? Where and how much? It's really that simple. So this is where we come along to be able to put life into, let's say, this world of measurement to help them give, let's say, their understanding to be able to help make their decisions. So to give a little bit of background, as far as the traditional practice, it has been around really 3 core different styles of field soil measurement: grid sampling, zone sampling, composite sampling. And what that is essentially, let's say, a technician drives out to a field and let's say a grid sampling approach of, let's say, this image that I just popped up, they systematically or in a uniform manner cut up, let's say, that field in, let's say, a series of grid cells. And the red dots in each of those cells is, let's say, navigation points from where they take their ATV vehicle and go from dot to dot and then physically extract a sample, maybe 6 cores, let's say, with the coring tool that you see in this cartoon. And that would fill, let's say, a sample bag. And so each of one of those red dots would represent, let's say, a sample bag that the technician would collect, and then those would get sent to the lab. The lab would then process, let's say, those samples, and then the results would come back, and then the grower would make decisions around those inputs. But one of these cell sizes, to be able to put it into perspective, quite often is about the size of 2 football fields butted side by side. And that sample may have about 1 pound of material. Okay, so it's not a lot of material for a big scale of land. Okay, that land could represent about 210 dump trucks of material. So again, not trying to cut down, let's say, this practice, but as I say, the grower is looking for more. And also the world wasn't created on, let's say, perfectly square grids either. So, but as I say, it is just something that has been relying on, let's say, lab samples analysis alone. So where our technology comes in, we're looking to be able to bring, let's say, that higher resolution approach, almost just very similar to, let's say, when we go chase, let's say, a TV, the higher resolution. This is really kind of the same sort of approach. But what we're doing is we're utilizing a technology with a gamma ray spectrometer. And what it's doing is the soil is giving off this natural radiation, and it's hitting us as we speak, as I'm speaking here right now, hitting yourselves as well, but we can't taste, smell it, or feel it as, let's say, humans. But this instrument can. And so it's quantifying, let's say, this natural energy of this geological natural decay, and we're quantifying it, digitizing it into a number that we can be able to utilize to be able to help with, let's say, the end result for, let's say, that grower. So we have, let's say, this instrument. We made it with, let's say, a GPS and, let's say, a tablet, and the raw data image looks very similar to what you see right here. So the operator would drive up and down the field, and I'll show some examples of, let's say, the instrument mounted on a vehicle here in a second. They would drive up and down the field, and they're collecting, let's say, this, what's called a fingerprint. Let's say that this is, let's say, a field fingerprint, and it's showing, let's say, the geological changes across the field. Okay, so here's just an example of, let's say, here's an ATV vehicle, sensor mounted on the front, tied with, let's say, GPS, and let's say the data logging hardware attached. But the flexibility where the sensor can be mounted on the back of a pickup truck or on a combine, or even, let's say, there's a compact version of this sensor that could even be mounted on a UAV. So it's very flexible for, let's say, the style and environment for, let's say, that a field may be enduring for, let's say, a technician doing this work. So overall, we, in a nutshell, we are collecting, let's say, this natural radiation coming out of the field with the sensor. We are also still taking some physical samples, okay, that are going to a lab, but they're more so, they're a reduced quantity, but they're strategically located basing on, let's say, the radiation levels across the field. So we're tying, let's say, the sensor data and, let's say, the traditional lab results together, and then we're injecting it into, let's say, our data processing center, which is AI based, also with, let's say, a team of individuals that are overseeing, let's say, the data processing center to be able to output these high resolution maps. That's kind of it in a nutshell. So here's some examples of, let's say, maps of, let's say, what a farmer would receive. So we have, let's say, an example, the sand content, soil pH, organic matter, and they're there would obviously be a legend tied to each map, but each and every color is representing, let's say, the various levels of a perspective of what there is really these opportunities. So maybe in the organic matter, where it's red, those could be really low organic matter levels, and that's where a grower could be able to go and possibly apply more compost. And then also with our technology is that we can drape the property over top of, let's say, the topography of the field. So to give, let's say, another perspective from a three-dimensional point of view, again, for helping, let's say, that grower make the decision. We're not helping them give the prescription with what they need to do to their field, but we're giving them, let's say, the information to help make those decisions, because there's so many different schools of thought on how to be able to create the amendments that they're looking to be able to optimize their field, or let's say their factory, to the best possible manner. Okay. So a little bit more about ourselves is, let's say, we started expanding internationally in 2017, where our home base for us is right here in Tavistock. And we are the concentration of, let's say, our service providers. We're a business to business business model, and the size of the quantity of our operators kind of radiate from our head office. They were all across Canada, in the US, all across North America, but then also we are overseas as well. So as I say, we started in 2017, and let's say we're essentially becoming, let's say, a vacuum. We're more so, let's say, a technology company than we are an ag. And say we're essentially, we have, let's say, a fleet. I would say it's the business model is very similar to, let's say, franchise setup. So they acquire the equipment, let's say those sensors from us, to be able to operate in all their various jurisdictions. And then all the data comes into, let's say, our data processing center to be able to, we do our magic to be able to send them back those map results. So into the IP, Jeff, do we we're going to work together on this, or should we jump right in?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just throw you another question here, and thanks for that fantastic introduction. And I always appreciate when I hear you speak, because I always learn just a little bit more about what you do and the what is precision ag. But you and I had a previous conversation, and as you shared with me at that time, you know, the sensor itself you acquire from a third party. And so I wouldn't mind if you'd share with, because that's an interesting aspect, right? Is that somebody else owns the sensor. How do you deal with that in your business model? There's potential insecurity of accessing the sensor.
Correct. Yeah, no, that's a great question, Jeff. So yes, as Jeff mentioned, yeah, we do acquire, let's say, the sensor from a third party based in Europe, and they don't have, let's say, a specialty around the knowledge of, let's say, agriculture. They've more so specialized historically of, let's say, gamma ray measurement and other applications, being mining, geoprospecting, etc. So, and we've more so taken, let's say, that technology off the shelf from those industries and, let's say, applied it into agriculture and specialized it for the needs in agriculture. So, but they hold, let's say, patents around, let's say, the development of the sensor that they take to the market. And then they have customized, let's say, a model that I showed you there earlier that we have customized for, let's say, the application in agriculture. Now, as far as, let's say, our relationship, well, let me just take a step back. We made a decision. We had an opportunity. We actually built a sensor back in the early days. Being about 8-9 years ago, we had an opportunity to be able to sell a sensor to an ag department of a university in the UK. And we received the recipe to be able to build the equipment. And we sold it to the university. They're still using it today. But we quickly learned that that wasn't going to be, let's say, our core competency. We figured, let's say, our strengths were of, let's say, digesting the data for, let's say, the use of the grower. So then with this current third-party supplier, with, let's say, the patents that they have applied to, let's say, this hardware, we now have, let's say, an exclusive arrangement for supplying, let's say, their technology into the ag sector. So, and that has worked out very well. And again, it's kept, let's say, ourselves focused on, let's say, the digital aspect, and let's say leaning on them for the hardware piece. Does that help? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And it truly is how the marriage works. And while recognizing the each individual's and SoilOptix's strength, which leads to my next question. And you've talked about the magic and the magic that SoilOptix provides. You shared that. And really that's where you also talk about being a tech company. And in terms of the software that you have, and maybe can you talk a little bit about the magic and what you consider your IP?
Sure. Okay. So I guess what is SoilOptix IP? So let's say it's a crafted set of data modeling analysis techniques in a nutshell that has been developed over, let's say, the past 10 plus years. It actually did originate in a university in Europe, but we took it off the shelf there. Essentially was a research project and a hobby, and didn't originate from ourselves. We took it off the shelf and composed it still from what was on the shelf is at its core, but we have expanded and fine-tuned it to a significant level. But to say that our evolution of, let's say, the core IP, as I say, is something that we hold very dear to ourselves for, let's say, the time and energy, because of, let's say, this modeling practice is not simple at all. It's almost, let's say, a cross between science and art. And we're trying to move to the extent of moving, especially the art piece, into getting a computer to do it. And it's not an easy feat, but we have a fabulous team that understand, let's say, the mission. They understand, let's say, the art, and they have moved mountains to be able to get us where we are today. And because it is really quite a remarkable system from what has been happened, let's say, at the core. It used to take me 8 to 10 hours to do one field. Now we have it down to, depending if all the stars align, we can process a field in a matter of seconds. So, but the fields that are a little bit more difficult, that's where our handcraft team is what we call them, to be able to process. So yeah, I say we've built, let's say, a data processing pipeline. And again, that is because really and truly at the end of the day, because the demand is continuing to increase, we're looking to be able to chase scale, but yet we're trying to avoid any sort of leakage, and also with, in part, to encompass, let's say, this IP at the core into, let's say, a digital system. Okay. I'm just going to move on here, Jeff, if that's okay. So as far as, let's say, what's important for protecting, it's essentially attempting to be able to maintain, let's say, our competitive advantage. So knock on wood, we've been in this space with, let's say, this IP, and we haven't had really any sort of competitor come directly compete with us, let's say, in the gamma ray space. We know that there are trying to be able to uncover and tap in for what we do know. But this is really, as I say, it's something that we're really looking to be able to maintain and be very protective of from our original plan for keeping this encompassed into really a trade secret. And I'll touch on that here in a second. So again, it's also providing, let's say, insurance for, let's say, investors and, let's say, other business partners that we do have, let's say, a systematic approach to protecting, let's say, this IP. Okay. So into, let's say, our ideas and how that we are, what we've taken to be able to protect it. So it's really around various encryptions. We have, again, coming back to being a tech company, we have various measures from a security on our infrastructure, even, let's say, from NDAs, because we often have requests, especially from research institutes, or we have requests for, let's say, the raw data. And that's one thing that we do not share unless that there is, let's say, a reasonable cause that is going to be mutually beneficial for, let's say, for both of us. So we're really trying to minimize let's say, public accessibility to, let's say, the infrastructure that's housing our sensitive IP, but also we want to restrict that information and data on a need-to-know basis. But as I say, we're really quite sensitive, because not only for myself, but it's also for, let's say, the team that understand with what we have in our hands. But also from talking about our team is people come and go. Now I can pleasantly say that our turnover of team members, we have a very loyal team, but our turnover has been very low, but yet many of them, especially on, let's say, the data processing side, have an understanding of our IP, and I'm say they leave, that knowledge goes with them. But we have, let's say, some measures in, let's say, our employee contractual agreement to ensure that we are protecting, let's say, for what they are gaining to a high degree of confidentiality. So moving on to, let's say, to patent or not to patent. Okay, so we, back in the early days, we consulted, let's say, a trademark lawyer, and they advised us to, after us sharing, let's say, with what we had in our hands, they advised actually to not to patent. Why? Largely because of the vulnerability with what actually a patent could expose us, and let's say really publish, let's say, those trade secrets publicly, which could actually pose us to risk. So it was actually their advisory to actually try to encompass it into, or encapsulate it into, a digital system, and then come back to revisit it again. So, yeah, as I mentioned, we are currently still sitting in, let's say, a trade secret format, again, very similar to, let's say, a Coca-Cola recipe approach. Do we have any regrets? None at all. Again, because it's worked for us. And also, again, probably our biggest risk is probably with, let's say, the team that we have, and ensuring, let's say, that our relationship with, let's say, our team is very strong, and that if, let's say, if anything does go sideways on, let's say, an exit with them, that we are bound, let's say, by that employee confidential agreement. But as, let's say, our brand awareness is growing, we're gaining more and more attention, our sophistication is increasing, but also part and parcel, we are encapsulating this into a system digitally that we still want to be able to chase, let's say, a patent, because it is something, and I could be wrong on this, but to my understanding, if it's in a patent format, then this aids us in, let's say, defense if, let's say, there is a breach, or let's say a line is crossed by a competitor, etc. So it's still our goal to visit, let's say, the patent aspect, but at least out of the gate, the trade secret aspect has worked for us very well. So just to be able to share on, let's say, some advice, lean on great resources, supportive business agency, obviously IAC, OCI, incubators, accelerators, finding, let's say, a trusting, reputable patent legal professional for, let's say, guidance, one that may not just be out chasing, let's say, to be able to the dollar, possibly for looking to the opportunity for filing a patent, but somebody that's going to give you really good sound advice. And then also really understand with what you have in your hands for IP, with what you're creating, and really be thinking about what avenues and again, lean on resources to be able to help minimize those exposure risks. Outside of that, that's what I have. Is that helpful, Jeff?
That was perfect, Paul. Thank you very much. I do appreciate that. So maybe if you don't mind, kind of, I don't think we need you to share your screen any longer.
Okay.
And if we can just bring Erin and Lori up as well, terrific. And I know Lori and Erin have heard a little bit about the SoilOptix story, but any thoughts maybe to you, Erin, on what you heard today?
Yeah, I think Paul presented a great example of why it's important to have a strategy. We talked about not you don't need to have all the different types of IP assets. You don't have to do it all on day one. It's about having a plan. So they opted for a trade secret. It's a great way to get started. And then they put in place all these systems and agreements and how to plan around how to lock it down, not on, they had a strategy around that. They're still continuing to chase the opportunity for patenting, but but that ability for someone to really be able to reverse engineer isn't there for them. So they're trying to extend their life. I think they've embarked on a great path so far. So I'm going to be paying attention to see what it is. And my background is in civil engineering, so I actually love soil. Soil is super fascinating. So that's my nerdy side.
Terrific. And I'll get to the question that's in the chat here in just a moment. But Lori, over to you just to talk a little bit about, Paul made recommendations on reputable resources to access. Do you want to talk a little bit about where they might access them through IAC?
Yeah, sure. So of course, we do have some public programming, so there's certainly opportunities to get up to speed on various subjects at IAC, just through checking out our websites, asking to stay informed and updated. But I would say that in terms of joining as membership, I believe it's being included in one of the chats here. You can go to ipcollective.ca/membership, and there's a lot of information and detail. Another point I'd throw in there is that there, I know, are some nuanced questions that business leaders have regarding the program, and our team is very accustomed to digging into a very specific area to help flesh through whether or not the IAC program is well suited to them. So don't hesitate to reach out, just even if you have some questions about it.
Perfect. And then question for you, Paul. So you go and scan a field and you provide the prescription. Who owns the IP over the reports generated for a particular field? That's a good question.
Excellent question. Yeah, and I apologize I didn't touch on that. So in a nutshell, and I'll read this through as I say, who owns the data? Okay, so we just take a step back from at the beginning, from when our process starts of, let's say we have the sensor and the sample data. So those it's like we're baking a cake. So those are, let's say, the two ingredients that are going into this cake. And there was a big question mark as who owned that ingredient data. And we consulted actually a data IP lawyer out of the US that specialized in the ag tech space. And it stumped him as far as how we should approach. But after some investigation, he came up with a recommendation that SoilOptix owns, let's say, that ingredient data. And that is stipulated through all of, let's say, our legal agreements of who owns the data. But the actual end result, let's say, the maps that we actually produce, our output, that is owned by the farmer, not by, let's say, our customer, let's say that service provider. They are more so the facilitator of, let's say, getting, let's say, that map data to the farmer. So if, let's say, that farmer wants to move from service provider A to service provider B, the data that was collected from service provider A moves to service provider B. Okay, was that helpful?
That's very helpful. Thank you, Paul. It does highlight the complexity in which you work, because you obviously have magic. You have a service provider, and then you have at the other end, you have the factory holder, the farmer. And all the way through that supply chain, you have to maintain security, maintain your IP. It certainly is a challenging opportunity. And it sounds like you are navigating it well, but are there some things that kind of keep you awake at night?
Oh, there's always something that keeps me awake at night. Yeah, I guess it still is. I often tell our team is we never want to be sitting in our hands. I think we've been at this business 9+ years now, and we don't have, let's say, any sort of, let's say, direct competition, let's say, in the gamma space. And I think I would be able to sleep just a little bit better to know Because as, let's say, we're growing, let's say we're probably a little bit more vulnerability to leaks. And if, let's say, we have some opportunity to be able to encapsulate this, to put a nice bow of protection on it, I think that's what's really going to add some relief to me.
Okay, perfect. And maybe a little bit on the, protection, and the question for Lori or Erin, how often do you think companies should revisit their IP strategy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's fluid, as your business is making changes, like Paul said, his company's scaling, as they're getting bigger, there are new nuances. What worked on day one isn't necessarily the right plan. So I think as your business is growing, I think it's at least a once a year, but probably more often. And certainly anytime you're making strategic business decisions to enter a new market, to, enter a new partnership agreement, I think it's really the right time to revisit your strategy. Like he said, I understand wanting to encapsulate it in a bow. Leakage is going to happen. It happens. And there's that whole concept of know-how, which I think in your space is probably a really interesting thing. You can't take stuff out of people's head once it's there and what they understand. And one way to reduce the uncertainty is develop assets, but it's got to be the right time. And the other thing I just wanted to say that I thought Paul mentioned that was really great advice is find the right expert. I love that you said that, because we just finished releasing a module for our members around that, because I think it's so critical to make sure you're working with the right people. You want to make sure you understand what you're trying to accomplish, and you've got the right people to help you, because IP is diverse and there's a ton of different areas, and no one person is an expert across the board. And so building that team and understanding what you're looking for, I really think is important, so they're part of your journey.
Perfect. Excellent. Thanks, Erin. We're just coming up on time here, and I thought maybe just kind of go around the table here and just last few words that to comment on, and maybe I'll start with you, Lori. Any kind of final comments you wish to share with the audience?
I'd just like to share again what a pleasure it was to be here today, and how much we appreciate having this partner interaction with OCI, so that we can continue to share really important information to business leaders across the province. So thanks again for setting up this event today.
Perfect. Thank you, Lori. Paul, anything else you wanted to share at the end here?
Yeah, I'm just going to echo with what Lori said. Yes, thank you very much for the invite and being able to share a bit of our story. But I'm just going to really echo again to ensure that people haven't forgotten about, let's say, this important aspect of their business, assuming that it is pertaining to themselves, but also in, let's say, I think some of the best kept secret, especially in, let's say, this province or even our country, is, let's say, the vast amount of resources that are out there to be able to assist in, let's say, the painting on, let's say, at least a roadmap or whatever various stage they are in, let's say, their IP security journey, and to really lean on them, because, say, the government is really looking to be able to help and aid to ensure, let's say, that we do have what innovativeness is taking part in this part of in our world here, or in our country. They want to ensure that we can be able to keep it secure here. And so as I say, that's the 2 cents that I have to offer, but thanks again for allowing me to participate.
Perfect. Great. Thank you, Paul. That's probably about 5 cents, but we'll leave it at 2. But with last word, Erin, anything else you wanted to share here before we kind of wrap it up?
Yeah, no, it was great to be here today. I love the discussion, and I would encourage everybody to think about there's no one size fits all scenario, and invest the time to understand and set a plan for your business so you can really set yourself up for success. Paul's a great example of someone who's invested the time up front to have a plan, and then educate himself and his team.
Terrific. Thank you, Erin. And with that, I just want to thank you all for joining us today, for Paul, Lori, Erin, and of course, you as the audience. I also want to take the special opportunity. This is our last event for this year, for this calendar year with IAC, not the last event, the last one for this year. And but I also want to thank the IAC team as excellent partners to work through what is data-driven clean tech and how IP strategy works in that sector. So thank you again for the support that IAC has provided in pulling these events off seamlessly. So just a couple of other things. So for latest programming and grants related to OCI, please visit our website, oc-innovation.ca. The information is in the chat there. Please check that out for ipcollective.ca for IAC as well. And with that, I just want to thank you all and enjoy your evening. Thank you. Bye.